What about when the children began to get a bit older? Were you faced with the awful choice that...
Well, having two children and having had a rather difficult time with the second one, born in Abo, who was 10 weeks pregnant, and Johnny nearly didn't survive, just through being so premature, and who knows why. It may have been the climate. I travelled out, you see, 6 months pregnant. I was nosily reading a letter over his shoulder that he'd had from Jack Trevor here, who'd been corresponding with him about the physical anthropological measurements, which we had great fun doing together. You know, he would have the prisoners out in the evening with calipers and measure their heads, and I would write down the...
So you were doing...
Yes, well, I mean, I was thought it was rubbish, and it did turn out to be rubbish, but still it was quite amusing in the evenings. Anyway, Jack Trevor was comparing figures and notes with him, and at the bottom there was a PS. I can see it clearly now, saying there's a lecture in social anthropology here. I think it might suit you, why don't you apply? So I said, why don't you? He wasn't very keen to, because I don't think at that time you did see the end of British rule. You may think so, but I think we were very happy
at that time they were going to have a registrar of cooperative societies, and the eastern and the western regions had been told to submit people who they would suggest should go to Cyprus to be trained in cooperation. And I was nominated for the eastern region, and it was a toss-up whether I went to Cyprus
young children in Cyprus
or not. Fortunately, it went to the western one, so I didn't have to worry. But when I came here, I had to tell the secretary here whether or not I'd accept the post, and I had to arrange for it to count as a transfer. I was transferred. It was considered employment to which I could be transferred, as it involved mainly teaching of cadets. Hardly anybody reading anthropology in those days, and about 50 cadets.
But the real thing was, when we left Nigeria on this occasion, he having applied for the job rather unwillingly, he was perfectly happy. The only thing was, he had then become a senior district officer, which would have, he realised, been more boring. He would have been sitting more in an office rather than bumming around the bush. But we didn't know, and that's how we managed to bring one or two masts back, not realising we wouldn't be returning with them, just for leave. And there was a bit of a fight over you can tell them about the government wanting to keep you. The governor put up a protest when you were offered the job.
They wanted to keep me, but I got Glyn Daniel, who was then secretary of the faculty board, to get the university to write and say they wanted to keep me too. And it was considered to have me, yes, that it would be very valuable to have me to lecture to cadets here, as I'd already myself been on this cadets course earlier on.
I was rather pleased the governor had to be
overruled.
It's not often they were. But we didn't know what we were going to get. And what was funny was that the loads that we'd packed up to leave until we returned couldn't be sorted out because there was no one to sort them. And they all came back regardless, all the extraordinary kitchen stuff that our Igbo cook had used in his, mud kitchen. All arrived in Cambridge. Everything. That's great.
I hope it went to a museum. Why did you say you didn't know that you were going back there? Because presumably if you'd applied for a job...
but it hadn't been sorted out, you see. There'd been an argument as to whether or not he would be allowed to leave. But of course...
I wasn't due for retirement.
No.
It's 43.
It was at the time when they were trying to get people to retire, but you had to be a bit older. And I'd reached the stage where they still wanted to hang on to me.
Well, I think they thought he was going to be quite a useful senior administrator. Why not? Most of his contemporaries who stuck it did. Got knighted and all.
So good on. Did you feel that it was all over? I mean, by that time when you left, when you read the footnote to the letter, you had the sense that...
I thought this would be better. I didn't want to have myself in England with my family and Gwilym out there. I'd had a miserable time being separated from my first child by leaving her in Cape Town. And it wasn't on. So I think he gradually realised that it was an impossible sort of life. Others were doing it, but it didn't work.
Yes.
Well, what also affected the position was that your salary wasn't made at all compatible with the difficulty of maintaining children in England. And all the people who had children retired and took advantage of the conditions of retirement.
I would suggest that was later.
Well, this is when...
Later, after you...
Well, after I'd gone, but this was the beginning. This was the beginning, and I'd have gone back to
What
this.
was miserable, though, financially, was that, of course, it wasn't regarded, he wasn't old enough to get any pension until he was old enough to retire from the university.
I was due to
They
get
didn't
my
get a
pension on
penny.
the retirement age. The retirement age was 45
And he was
then.
43.
I was 43, so I couldn't do it that way.
Did worry us a bit.
The Colonial
But you're
Office
going to get a
said
job.
the Colonial Office said I could keep my pension rights,
Yes.
but that turned out, as it happened, that I could only draw my pension when I retired at the retiring age from university, which was 68.
Had a university job, okay, but it was very poorly paid at that point.
Was it?
And we hadn't had to worry too much in Nigeria. The cost of living wasn't high and the salary was good.
Well, my salary as a lecturer at Cambridge, and they added it up because of my age, which was 40-something, you see, was £250 a year,
Yes.
plus something or other for fellowship allowance.
It was a great pinch, I may say, with two children.
Was it?
And I think it was another
Very little money,
£250
then.
for in lieu of fellowship allowance, so it amounted to about 500.
So it was about 500. What would a reasonable house have cost at that time, do you think? Did you
Well,
buy a house?
Well, I bought a house
My
for
father helped.
2,500.
But we were very, very skint for a long time.
5 times or so.
Never left me, I think.
Yes. It has impressed itself on you. It was very difficult the first few years.
Well, the first 2 years were hell because England and Cambridge were still rationing. You got one egg, and
didn't get anything
you had
Friday.
points, and undergraduates.
Get the eggs
The
too.
story is correct. Undergraduates could carry a certificate from their tutor saying that they couldn't wear a gown, and you had to wear a gown in those days if you
Yes.
props saw you, as you'd exhausted your coupon allowances. You hadn't got any clothing coupons left.
Yes.
And they abolished their wearing of
It really
gowns.
was quite a struggle. I used to share a hat with a neighbour.
A hat?
A hat, because I was bidden, although Gwilym was only
How can you
a
share
member.
a hat? You walked along in parallel with
Well,
this
no,
hat
because
over
we
the
only
two.
wore a hat when we were bidden to college. She went to Magdalen and I went to Jesus once in the winter to a sherry party and once in the summer to a outdoor party. And it was essential to wear a hat, and hats were expensive and we didn't wear them otherwise. I mean, that was really how we
Just
did.
hope that no one
And we had, of
be
course,
at both colleges
There
and
were
see you.
second-hand prams and things. But it was lovely all to be together. It was, no regrets.
You were bidden to college. This was a formal bidding of the wives to college, was it?
It was so rare. It was quite an exciting social occasion for me.
Before we leave that part of Africa, Ursula, we heard about Gwilym's life. What were your impressions coming from? You said you've been around
It was
the world.
very exciting. Unfortunately, looking back, I feel I didn't make nearly enough of it. But we were in a bush station, and there was just one other expatriate. We never called them expatriates, did we? But a Scots doctor, a rather dour Scots doctor who'd got his wife and family in England. But I couldn't really get to know many of the, say, clerks' wives and people, because they really didn't speak any English. We were to say everybody was speaking pidgin English, but the sort of the women that I would like to have got to know, I didn't. So in a way, I suppose it was rather lonely. Subsequently, when I was the second tour, when I had a baby out there, that was different. But
did you ever get to feel you ever got to know any of the Africans at all? You mentioned the language difficulty.
I suppose
Was there a huge gap?
really only when I was with you. I used to go around and sit in native courts and listen to this bedlam.
Mm.
The bedlam that he referred to earlier was something that was a very good training for later years, because no amount of noise can distract him from what he's thinking of now, because it used to be absolutely amazing the noise they made, and he would just go on calmly writing his judgment.
Mm.
And then we travelled a lot, and that was great fun.
Mm.
And we had exciting instances of driver ants walking through our camp beds and all over our mosquito net in the middle of the night in mud rest houses, and it was very exciting sort of life.
Mm.
I enjoyed it enormously. I enjoyed it more than any other part, I think.
Mm. So you were absolutely split. You would like to have stayed, but with the idea of the children.
Well, having two children, I didn't want to live in a separate... If we'd been allowed to have the children there, that would have been fine, and I think they would have been all right.
Mm. You wouldn't have found it difficult to bring up children?
Well, until they needed education, I don't see why it should have been a problem.
Mm.
It did seem unreasonable.
Mm.
Well, provided you could keep them free from malaria with drugs, they didn't get nearly so many nose and throat complaints as they got in a temperate country like this.
Mm.
There were rather sort
They
of
were never
exciting
sniffling
moments,
with
like
colds and things.
Gwilym would bring a leper back in a hurry. Somebody wanted to transfer them to the leper settlement, and I was with this very small baby sort of sitting in the front of this van, and I would find that the chap in the back was a leper. I did wonder if this was wise, but of course realised, learning by experience, that leprosy is not all that infectious.
Mm.
I was very much under your... You really had all the answers. He'd been running his house out there for 14 years, and I went along very much with his decisions.
You didn't find the difficulty that sometimes has been found in that case, where he'd got his establishment, he's trained
His
up, he's
cook,
got the
you're
cook
quite
and all
right,
these
his cook did have a miserable time, and he was a wonderful, faithful old servant. It really, having a madam was just too much for him. It was
I
very
had
sad.
to pension him off, but he had, and he died fairly soon after, one of these aorta things that burst in his neck.
Fortunately not while we were there, but on leave. But that was one of the sadnesses. I felt, he and my mother-in-law, I felt I had treated badly. The poor cook, he couldn't cope because he'd never really been a cook anyway. He was horrified by some of the things I thought we needed. Nice chap too. Servants were exciting and fun, and we sometimes argued about them, but they were awfully nice. I think he was easy people to like, and they had such a good sense of humour.
Who did you meet any interesting people? I mean, Europeans when you were out there. I think the name Julian Huxley was mentioned. How did you come across?
Well, Julian Huxley came out with the secretaries of the faculty boards of Oxford and secretary of the University of Oxford and Cambridge to advise on the establishment of a university for British West Africa. They recommended it should be at Ibadan. The Gold Coast immediately said they must have one too, and so they had theirs as well. But they came round to Amahia to see the local chiefs and so on, and amongst them was Julian Huxley, and I was able to take him and show him some of the local art things in my division.
What sort of man was he? Was he
well, he was mainly interested in African art, not interested particularly in this thing, and he, as soon as try and bring the meeting to a close as possible and say, now can we see something?
And he was impressed by your knowledge of it, surprised, I think, and then later, in 1939, suggested you wrote a book. You were horrified on West African art, and I remember you saying to me afterwards, what a ridiculous idea, I couldn't possibly write on anything but a very small area. I was sort of impressed with the idea of you even knowing him.
Well, he did eventually say, when you come to it, well, I said, if you can find a publisher. I said, and I told him what I wanted to write on. And eventually he did. The nearest he could get to it was an article in the Geographic magazine, that magazine.
Yes,
I published a small article on Nigerian art in that.
Do you
But
remember
that was the nearest approach, and after that, as far as that art was concerned, I let it drop and waited until I retired, practically.
that snooty governor, not that he was anybody very special, afterwards Lord Milnerton.
Lord Milner?
Milverton.
Oh, Milverton.
He, of course, when governors travelled in the bush, they turned you out of the only decent house that they could stay in, and you had to push off into the rest house, and of course do your stuff with them.
Mm.
And he was a very anaesthetic sort of man, and he saw that beautiful little album and looked at it with great scorn, you know. I mean, we had the house, Gwilym arranged his bush houses most beautifully. We had all sorts of lovely African things.
You
all
pointed
around.
at something. What?
Well, this one here.
Bring it up.
Can you bring it over and we can have a look?
She was in the house. We left the house looking as nice as we could with all our lovely African things.
Mm.
And this, I don't know what adjective to use for the
Armless
gentleman.
wonder.
Yes, but he said, looking at his ADC or whatever the chap was, oh, that does solve the problem of what to do with her arms. And he obviously hadn't any kind of opinion on her whatsoever. And I was very indignant, wasn't I, being turned out of my house for this butch sort of chap. But I don't think I ever met anyone interesting, British interesting like that. He had a few friends, but...
Well, Casey Murray.
Oh, yes, I never saw enough of him.
He was a
Only
nice
when we
man.
went to Lagos.
He was an art expert, more or less built up the Nigerian.
The real reason
museum.
why you ever published that first art book, because you felt he would have done it if he'd lived longer and had more energy.
He died.
He was killed.
Well, he was perfectly healthy and he retired and lived in Lagos in a fisherman's hut.
Mm.
And he was killed when he was going down in a motor lorry to open a museum at Benin, because the Nigerian government had decided to change from driving on the left-hand side of the road to driving on the right. And none of the drivers, being able to read all right, had appreciated this. And Murray ended up in a terrible car crash on the road to Benin
Two buses.
and was killed
I see. That's sad.
prematurely, poor man.
Coming back to, arriving at Cambridge in 1947?
1946, December 1946.
That was just before the terrible winter, was that?
Yeah, I went through the terrible winter and it was so cold that I thought I'd got malaria when I was really freezing.
You and I
And
arrived.
when I got malaria, I thought it was I was merely being cold.
We arrived about the same time. I, as a little boy of 7 from Assam, and to that winter, and you
God.
slightly older. And who was it at the department then? You mentioned Glyn Daniel.
Well, the department was very small in those days. We got Glyn Daniel was secretary of the faculty board. Graham Clark was there.
And Professor.
No, he wasn't professor. Dorothy Garrett, I think, was professor. And Hutton was anthropology professor.
J.H. Hutton, yes.
J.H. Hutton, the Naga expert.
Mm.
And he and Glyn used to settle faculty board matters over lunch, more or less.
He was chairman of the faculty board, was he? I mean,
He was chairman and head of the faculty.
I see. Yes, it was tiny.
And Graham Clark was the sort of big noise in the archaeology side. But and Dorothy Garrett, when she was in Cambridge, when she was doing a lot of digging, of course, in France. And Charles McBurney was here.
Ah, there were a lot of archaeologists.
Oh, a lot of archaeologists. I got the job because Hutton had offered the job to some anthropological friend of his. I don't know who he was. I can't remember the name now.
It wasn't J.P. Mills?
No. He was a young man,
Ah.
about my age. Well, he's relatively young. And then the university found he'd done this and said, you can't do this without advertising it. You must advertise it. So you had to write to this chap and say, you'll have to wait until it's been advertised before you can have it. By which time this man took and got a job somewhere else. And Hutton was left without anybody.
Jack Trevor wrote that in your
And so I was offered the job. And it was a bit, I came to see him, and there was a difficult time because there were 2 Huttons and 2 professors at the same time in Cambridge, and I went to the wrong professor's house. And the professor's wife was quite used to people arriving unannounced at her house, for her husband had asked to come to lunch and hadn't told her. So she seated me down, and it wasn't until the wrong Professor Hutton turned up that the error was discovered, by which time I was rather late for lunch with the real Huttons.
I see. And when you did find the real Huttons, what sort of man was J.H.
Well,
Hutton?
he was a cheerful little man, very active, rather like one of these border terriers, rushing around the whole time.
Mm.
And he was very good with dogs. You know the story about him and his dog. We've
Yeah.
always had dogs in this museum.
Yes.
He had a beautiful golden retriever, which was very well trained. And the professor's room was then in what is now the room used as a sort of common room where you drink coffee, but it was the boardroom then and
Yes.
the professor's room. And there was a large tablecloth over his table, which he used as a desk. And the dog was trained to go underneath this desk and be shrouded by the tablecloth and go to sleep while the professor was in the building. And if you wanted to know if the professor had gone home or was in the building, you checked on the dog. And an old lady came and called, wanted to see the professor. The museum attendant said, "Well, I'll come and see if the professor's still in the museum, madam." And he went along and went to the professor's room, lifted up the tablecloth, looked under the table, said, "I'm sorry, the professor's gone home."
So he was a slightly eccentric character. What sort of lecturer was he? Was he a good lecturer?
I never went to his lecture,
Mm.
but all I knew when I came here was that the precise course that I'd had at Oxford 30 years or whatever it was previously was being administered as anthropology at this place. There was a course on material culture, and he said to me, "You will of course be," saying that this was the next year,
Mm.
"You will be giving my lecture on material culture." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about material culture." And he said, "Well, you can have my notes." And he lent me his notes, and they were marvellous. There were about 4 pages. Lecture 1, fire pistons, nothing else at all. And then lecture so-and-so, voice disguise, and so on, completely sort of Balfour stuff from the Pitt Rivers. And at the same time, Jack Trevor, who was then the physical anthropology lecturer, went sick and was off duty for God knows how long, and I was told I'd have to give his lectures. So I routed out my lectures that I'd recorded, having had been given to me at Oxford previously, and gave those lectures. And the people I gave them to were these unfortunate cadets. They were the only people reading anthropology, and they were in their 2nd or 3rd year, were Leonhardt and Cunnison, who now retired.
Mm.
But they were the only students here at that particular
Just
time.
2 students.
What?
Just 2 students at that.
2 white students, yes, and the rest about 60 cadets.
Mm.
And I had to give about 60 lectures to these damn cadets for the good of their souls. They were, because in order to qualify for a lecturer's salary, so I later understood, you had to give the average number of lectures.
Mm.
And Hutton had so arranged it that these cadets should get 60 lectures in anthropology. They were getting lectures in economics and in all sorts of other subjects as well. I soon discovered with them that there was no point in lecturing them, they ought to read a few books. So I turned these lectures into what eventually ended up as seminars and supervised them. And I drew my supervision fees for supervising these lectures for a couple of years before the university got onto the fact that I was breaking the rules. And so we called the supervision seminars and got round it that way. And I didn't get paid for them, of course, once I called them a seminar.
Mm.
But we had a lot of trouble with my paper because I had to share anthropology, it's the paper, with economics.
Mm.
There was a man called Barr who had to do the same and give the same fantastic number of lectures in economics to these cadets in order to keep his
Pressure up.
pressure up.
Mm.
And he wasn't prepared to change, and none of the cadets seemed to understand his lectures. So they invariably failed the economics questions in the paper, but they always passed mine. So they always got about 50%, which took them through the paper. And we always had a fearful argument at the examiners' meeting, Barr saying these people ought to be failed. People say, no, they can't be failed because... Later on, I think they changed it and had a separate paper, but not until very much later, when it became a course on development, and there were no more cadets going out to Africa.
Mm.
But the pattern then was, if you were white, and not a cadet, you qualified in anthropology, or took a first degree in anthropology here, and then you migrated to Oxford, where you had EP and Fortis, and went on and took a PhD there.
Mm. People didn't stay and do PhDs at
Yeah.
Cambridge at that time.
Well, there was an unfortunate Indian who was doing a PhD under Hutton, and they failed him, and he only got an MSc or something, which was really bad for him because, of course, his salary was correspondingly reduced when he got back to India.
Yes, you don't know who that was.
I don't remember the name of the unfortunate man. You can check it up in the files.
Mm.
But I took the place here, and that's why they were so anxious to get me, of Evans Pritchard.
Oh.
He had come here as a lecturer after the war, and then he got this Oxford appointment
As professor.
as professor.
Mm.
And Hutton said to me, you'll be lecturing on Evans Pritchard's special area.
Mm.
I looked up the special area. Africa with special reference to the central region. And I said, well, I'd better go across and see EP in Oxford and see what he's been lecturing about and what he calls central special reference to the central area. And when I saw EP, he said, oh, well, I put it in like that so that I could lecture where I wanted to. You can lecture wherever you wanted to. And I said, well, I can't quite do that because you have already been lecturing to these people on a particular area. And he said, well, it's got to be somewhere in East Africa. And I said, well, can you suggest any books? Because I don't know anything about East Africa. And he said, thought very hard. He said, well, there's the Noor. And then I said, well, any others? He thought again. He said, well, there's the Azande. So I came back, having been stuck with East Africa, and I looked up, I gathered he was lecturing mainly on Uganda.
Mm.
And apart from the Noor and Zandi, I looked up a book written by an agricultural officer on farming in Uganda and lectured off that.
Mm. What sort of person was EP? I mean, how did he strike you? You've got to know him a bit more.
Oh, EP was very cheerful, easygoing, and I never saw much of him because I was here and he was in Oxford the whole time.
Mm.
But I found him very easy to work with and to talk to and so on.
Mm.
And of course I found him very easy to read.
Mm.
Problem with Fortis was that he lectured all right when you could hear him. But his books were written by a psychologist in that sort of complicated language.
You
Having
found
read the dynamics, I found that I thought hard and said, my God, these are just like the Igbo, but I never thought they were as complicated as that.
yes. Your mention of Fortis brings up the fact that when you first came here, there was Hutton and
Well, it was
yourself.
Hutton and myself.
Was
Then
it-
soon after, the university provided a second lecturer and they appointed Rio Fortune.
Ah, yes.
And then just before he left, there was another lectureship, and because the government kept putting in money to anthropology, and Hutton went and appointed Ethel John Lindgren.
Yes. What, lingering on Fortune for a moment, what sort of are your memories of Rio Fortune? Because he was obviously a distinguished anthropologist.
Well, he was very pleasant socially, but completely bats as far as lecturing or talking about anthropology. His students, I think, had got him taped. They said that he thought in Dabu.
He'd worked in Dobu.
He'd written this book, Sorcerers of Dabu, and his students said, he thinks in Dabu.
So they couldn't understand his
Well, they
doctrine.
used to attend his lectures for a couple of times and then give up.
Mm.
And we merely used to give him some sort of lectureship. We couldn't do anything about him when Fortis came
Mm.
because he'd been appointed to the retiring age.
Mm. What was he like as a colleague in meetings and things like this?
Oh, he'd ask absurd questions, and which had nothing, were quite irrelevant, and he'd start saying something and then think something else and switch on to that without your noticing it. I think he was really slightly mad
Mm.
because he never wrote anything
Mm.
and he never lectured anything, and then he created a lot of trouble in other departments by attending their lectures and then at the end asking damn fool questions, and the lecturer couldn't be sure whether the man was trying to pull his leg or was asking something really random.
This was after he retired, was it? Or
No,
even
this
then?
was while he was still here because he had nothing to do, because nobody wanted him to supervise and nobody went to his lectures.
Mm.
He'd give lectures for a couple of times, and then nobody being there, he'd not bother to turn up for the rest.
And then was he retired gracefully and later on, I mean early retirement or what?
No, you couldn't. It wasn't early retirement. You couldn't retire.
So he continued.
He retired when he was due to retire and not before.
I wonder how they came to appoint him. Did they not know about his reputation for madness?
He had a very good reputation, or at least Hutton accepted it as such. I don't know. I never asked Fortis about it, and I don't think Fortis has ever consulted about him.
Mm.
But you see, the whole idea was to have somebody lecturing in Melanesian.
Mm.
And having Fortune here meant that our students, if they wanted to do anything on Melanesia, gravitated to the LSE and went to Firth, of course.
To escape from fortune.
Well, we had nobody who would teach it.
Mm. At the end of, I think Hutton retired in about 51, was it?
I can't remember now. I
Was it-
have a
or
terrible
49?
memory for dates.
Around that time, there was when he retired, there was a legendary farewell party, wasn't there, for him?
There were all sorts of parties for him,
What?
because we used to have parties on the river in which we, with the students,
Mm.
there weren't so many students in those
Mm.
days, of course, in which we lashed two canoes together, and Geoffrey Bushnell, who's curator, lent us objects from the museum that were expendable. And we played at throwing Australian boomerangs and so on. Boomerangs weren't quite so successful because they're made of wood that sinks. We didn't know that. And we spent a long time diving into the river trying to recover some of them.
So a few museum
And we
objects.
also had a party at the Green Man, which is the one you were thinking
Yes.
of, which was referred to in the Prince of Wales's talk, I think.
Yes, that's right. What was notable about that?
Well, everybody came in costumes. I came in one of these masquerade costumes, and other people came in costumes. And Ethel John Lindgren was there, and she brought her husband, who kept pursuing people, the way lap hunters do, or lap herders do.
Yes, that must have been tremendous fun. So this is about the time Maya comes in 1950. Did you get to do any more field work after you come back to become an anthropologist?
Well, after I came back, my first assignment was a parliamentary one. I was appointed as sole commissioner to go to Basutoland to inquire into ritual murders, which the British press were advertising in a big way.
Mm.
Before I went, she was around, my wife was rung up, and they said, "Is your husband is a detective?"
Come on, Ursula's going to join us for this bit.
Join us for this bit.
Because it was obviously Ursula who was rung up.
Well, you were rung up. What did they say to you on the phone?
They said to me, it was the Express or something, just didn't say who they were. Is your husband a Sherlock? And I said no and put the receiver down. And next day there was a headline in the Express saying, "Wife says no Sherlock." But we were rung up. I was rung up a great deal.
Really?
Now the other heading was Sherlock Jones fights voodoo. It was the best heading.
And another longer article in a more respectable paper was instead of punting his family down the Cam, Sherlock Jones will be whatever it was, you know. They loved it. It was very dramatic.
But what was the cause of all this?
Well, the cause of all this was that there was a lodge in Basutoland. They had an absurd system whereby you kept proliferating chieftainships the whole time. More and more were being appointed, and some people were having their land being divided up, their territory being divided up and given to smaller ones and so on. And this had led to people fighting for position, and the only way left to fight was magically. And the magic they were using was medicines. And the medicines had to be obtained from, had to have human power in them. And you got the human ingredients, extracted them from some unfortunate who was killed, but you had to extract them from him while he was still alive. And they had a lot of these. And it built right up until it got to the chiefs right at the top of the list. And I had to go out and write a report on this and suggest what could be done.
What was your report?
Well, my report was that it was happening, and that this was the situation, and until the situation was remedied, it was likely to go on, unless because they could not easily obtain a conviction. They had been obtaining convictions, but they'd used the evidence of people who were alleged to be involved in it, and these were said to be unreliable or something of that sort.
Supergrasses.
And also they couldn't get people to otherwise admit to having done it, because they were all sworn to forget all about it.
It's very gruesome because they wanted something to cure blindness. They
I can sort that one out. Now, this was a very good example of magic, if you like. One particular medicine was obtained. They wanted to get a man off who was being tried for one of these ritual murders, so they committed another one to obtain the right medicine to make the judge blind and pleased with the prisoner and blind to what he'd done. And in order to do this, they had to have somebody from the Sia tribe or clan, Sia being a Soto word for smooth over and make easy and stop the trouble. And you had to be blind to make the judge blind to the offence, and they managed to track down and murder an unfortunate old blind Sia woman. That sort of thing. But the murders were always made to look as though they were accidents too. That was another thing. And the participants afterwards were put through a medicinal arrangement which made them forget all about the action, so that if they should come to court they couldn't give any evidence.
What happened afterwards? Did it die down or?
It died down. It faded out gradually. But what happened was it died down also because the chief protagonist for the Basutoland chieftainship, or at least he was backing somebody else, he got hung for one of these ritual murders.
What was this about the House of Commons having bits of bodies or whatever
Well, all that happened was somebody said that it was the most lurid document that was ever laid on the floor of the House of Commons.
Your report?
My report, which listed 100 or more of these horrible crimes, giving details.
Were you ever in danger at all? Or?
Oh no, not at all. It was a very interesting episode. And I was able to help the Basutoland government out to some extent by explaining what was meant by native administration. because their previous High Commissioner, before he'd been wafted on to be Governor of the Gold Coast, had introduced native administration into the Suitland, and nobody knew what the hell it meant. Having come from Nigeria, I was able to explain to them something about it.
How long did you spend in that?
I spent about 4 months or so, working pretty hard and covering the whole area and getting a very good idea of the Suitland. And I worked like mad to get my report written while I was on the boat going back. And then I discovered why you appoint these commissions. The idea is to damp things down and create a pause, a suitable pause, where you can say, we can't say anything about it now because it's a commission of inquiry is going into it. Then when interest in the subject in the press has died down, then you publish a report, but not till then.
Yes, as with the Guinness takeover.
What is happening, you'll see it all the time, but I was new to it then, and I wrote my report in a hurry, and then was very surprised to find it wasn't published for another year.
Yes.
And of course, some of these reports, they sit on them indefinitely.
So you then came, this was 1950, you came back, and Meyer Fortis was then appointed, well, around that time, appointed professor. What sort of person was he?
Well, he had a very raw deal here, because he came here and he found that I was the only able-bodied lecturer in social anthropology he'd got. He'd got one crazy man called Rio Fortune, and he'd got a woman who was hard at work with her husband introducing reindeer into Scotland and never got anywhere else.
Ethel John Lindgren.
Ethel John Lindgren. And he didn't know what the hell to do about it, and he formed the opinion that he would have to get rid of Lindgren because she had only just been appointed and hadn't come up to 3 years when you were confirmed. And when her confirmation came up, he felt he would have to do the unfortunate thing of saying that she shouldn't be continued, should be dismissed. And this created a hell of a furor, as you can imagine. Because you know our faculty board, it contains all sorts of people who have nothing to do with social anthropology. The archaeologists, the teaching archaeologists backed us. All the others, and anybody else who had, and the physical anthropologists, backed Ethel John. And the whole place was completely divided. And the faculty board, when they sat on it, and it included people like Noel Annan, who's now moved on to higher realms, decided, well, they would give her a trial and they'd attend her lectures. And they did. And we gave her a course of lectures on religion, I think it was. And they went something like this. Today we're going to speak about animism. Then she gave a definition of animism. Now the Northern Toongoos do this. And the rest of the lecture, waffle about Northern Toongoos. Then the second lecture, next time, today we're going to talk about spirit possession. Now the Northern Toongoos. And so it went on. And that convinced any little sane-minded person that Fortis had no option but to get rid of her. But people wouldn't speak to each other on the board for quite a long time after that. And I was secretary and I had to take the full weight of it.
Oh, it must have been very traumatic.
It was very funny in many ways.
But did you like Meyer as a person? Was he a good colleague? Or?
I liked Meyer. Of course, what Meyer did, which didn't help him, he consulted his co-professor Dorothy Garrett, not knowing that she was a boon companion of Lindgren.
Oh, I see.
Which didn't help him.
No. Then this was sometime in the 50s, perhaps it was a bit later, the department began to expand in size, didn't it?
Yes.
Even more.
Well, the department expanded in size for one simple reason, I think, and that is that the schools and other people ceased to be interested in classics, and the number of classic people offering classics here went right down. And as classics went down, a lot of people had to find some other art subject
Mm.
which didn't include maths, which they could offer.
Mm.
And that's why we had so many girls reading anthropology.
Mm.
I asked one of my students at Newman, why did you want to read anthropology? She said, well, I didn't want to read anthropology. When I came up, I wanted to read history. But they told me their history quota was full. I was up to the standard, and if I wanted to come, they'd accept me, but I would have to read something else.
Mm.
And they offered me geography, one
Mm.
or two other things, estate management, anthropology.
Mm.
And so I read anthropology.
Mm.
And I also had a number of classicists
Mm.
reading anthropology who transferred from classics because they found it so dull.
Mm.
They said at Oxford, once you've got through the texts in classical moderations,
Mm.
you then go on to philosophy and interesting things, but in Cambridge it's still the books.
Mm. Mm.
And we find anthropology, as study of living people, far more interesting. But there was a general swing, and we gradually increased from
Mm.
3 or 4 or 5
Mm.
to a very large number as the cadets sort of faded out.
Mm. The people who came were very distinguished. I'm not sure in what order they came. Perhaps Edmund Leach, was he the first, or was it Audrey Richards who first came in to swell
But
the
wait a
department?
minute. Edmund, Forties tried to get Edmund and eventually successfully managed to wean him away from the LSE and bring him
Yes.
here.
Yes.
Audrey would have liked to have been taken on here, but she felt that Forties was opposed to it.
Mm.
I think she was wrong. I think the reason for that was that Forties was bringing Goody in here and couldn't get another Africanist.
Mm.
And when he got another Africanist, either Audrey wasn't about or he got, what's his name?
Ray Abrahams.
Ray Abrahams.
Mm.
But she was always on the side here
Mm.
and supervised for Newnham, but was never asked to lecture here or refused to lecture if she was asked.
Really? She didn't
Yes.
lecture?
No. You look
She-
through the books and so on. They might have given an occasional honorary lecture or something like that, but she never gave a course of lectures here because I don't think she was attached in that way.
That's interesting. I do remember now that she ended up as Smuts reader.
They made her a Smuts reader, and that helped a lot. And after that, we probably brought her in.
Mm.
Because then, of course, anthropology had expanded a great deal, and we were also having this SNA, or whatever this other degree is, in which you have philosophy and anthropology and history and God knows what else on a course.
Mm. What was your recollections of Audrey? Did you get on well with her?
Oh, we liked Audrey very much, but I didn't see much of her until her retirement, really, when she was here.
Mm. She seemed very perceptive and...
Oh, she was a magnificent person and a very good anthropologist. And where one met her primarily was at these social anthropology meetings, a great deal.
Yes,
But we never met her teaching because she didn't.
Mm. What about Jack? How did you get on with Jack?
Quite well. Jack, I read both of Jack's. I was an examiner for his, whatever it was, BSc or whatever it was he got at Oxford.
On the Lodegar?
On the Lodegar, and then I examined him again on the death property and the ancestors. And we got on quite well with him.
Mm.
It was the friction occurred between from the part of Edmund Leach, of course, who felt that Jack was Forties Elisha, and that he was left out in the cold, and presented that, but that got cured a bit as soon as they gave him an honorary professorship or whatever.
Yes.
Personal
A personal chair. Mm.
Personal chair.
Yes, it was a notorious opposition between Forties and Leach, both intellectually and emotionally and in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find Edmund Leach?
Oh, I got on. I liked him,
Mm.
and I admired his lectures and his style and that.
Mm.
And he did a lot for the department, of course. He built up all the Southeast Asian studies and taking all those people to Ceylon.
Mm.
Put that very nicely on the anthropological map.
Yes. And he presumably was behind Tambaya coming as well, was he?
I think he was, yes.
Was, and you knew S.J. Tambaya?
Well, I knew him and liked him again.
Mm.
No, we had a very happy time once we got rid of Ethel-John. There was a little bit of friction between, on the part of Leach.
Mm.
I remember, oh yes, I remember. Should I put this on?
Yes, yes.
I remember a famous occasion. As you know, it's only recently that anthropologists have begun again to take senior doctorates.
Yes.
EP and Forties and people like that refused to take them because they were given by Oxford to Meek and other people who they felt weren't proper anthropologists.
Mm.
And then Jack Goody put in for one.
SCD. Mm.
For a senior doctorate,
Yes.
an SCD, where you wear red gowns and
Yes.
what's known in front, purple in front, or
Mm.
heliotrope. And Leach exploded at the meeting. He said, well, who the hell is going to examine him? And Simon Fortis suggested Shapiro.
Mm.
And Shapiro wasn't getting caught on this one. He wrote back and said that he was not prepared to examine him because the salary, the fee that he would get for it would be far too small considering the volume of books that he would have to read.
But they did find someone because...
Well, they found something, and Jack got his, quite rightly got his senior doctorate.
Mm.
And so would the others that they'd put in for it.
Mm.
But they couldn't find anybody who was a senior doctor, of course,
Mm.
because there weren't any, because
Mm.
Meek had died.
Mm.
And Meek certainly wouldn't have been capable of examining him
Mm.
anyway.
Were there any students who you taught who you particularly have either become very distinguished anthropologists or anything else, or you particularly remember?
Well, various. I taught a very large number of the whole bunch of them that have gone out from here that went to Africa at all. I didn't have anything to do much in their latter years, their second years, with the Indian ones and the Southeast Asians.
So what sort of people? Jean Lafontaine?
Well, Jean Lafontaine was one. There was a famous occasion when I set her an essay on Melanesian kinship and said she should refer to the sexual life of savages for getting data. She came very red-faced to me the next day and said she'd been to the UL to try and get the book out. And apparently it's in the banned books section. And they wouldn't give it her unless she got a certificate from her tutor saying that she wanted it for academic purposes.
Those were the days.
Those were the days, it's still there.
Yeah, probably is, yes. So there was Jean and some other Africanist.
Jean and that chap who's just died in Australia.
Uh,
What's his name? Something.
Barn.
No.
mm.
There was a terrible business. He just managed to get his first, because if he didn't get his first, he would have lost his research grant. And he suddenly fell in love with a girl who was also reading anthropology, and she didn't get anything because she walked out of all the exams. She was so overcome by falling in love with him.
Yes.
What's the man's name?
Well, we'll come back to
He'll
him.
come back to it. I can't
Yes.
remember the name, but he went to Australia, and one of the many Australian people.
And he's died.
He's died since. You
Yes.
saw him. He had his obituary in the Times.
Did you teach the Strathurns, Marilyn
Yes.
and
Well,
Andrew.
to some extent I
But they
did.
were-
They again went to New Guinea, and so I didn't teach them in latter years. No,
Yes.
I didn't. I taught Abrahams to some extent too.
Ray Abrahams. Yes. Well, I think
But I taught a whole lot of other people. William Watson. Did you ever hear of him?
Oh yes, Manchester School.
Manchester School. Well, he was wished on to me when I first came here by the senior tutor of Jesus, who said, I've got somebody here, he's an ex-air pilot and I can't do anything with him. He's completely hopeless. Can you take him over? And I taught him, and he never looked back.
No, he was a small Scotsman. with
Small,
with a
little
liking-
Glaswegian.
with a liking
I
for
don't know
drink.
whether he came from the Gorbals, but he was very, he was very full of
Pugnacious.
himself. A tiny little Scotsman.
Yes, I remember him. Gwilym, I think that we're just coming to the end of our tape. I think it would be nice if Ursula just came over.
Sherry.
Ursula, come and join Gwilym just for the last minutes, for about 1 minute. Ursula, have you ever regretted being married to an anthropologist?
No, I can't think of anything more interesting. It was quite interesting being married to someone with 3 careers, as I now see it.
What is the third?
Well, he now calls himself a grand an art historian, and he is very much appreciated in America. That's the point.
Yes.
I love all his American admirers. They've become great friends, and it's good to be able to go on doing something which is new and yet connected with your first hobby.
So you've been to America, haven't you, Gwilym?
Oh, I've been to America. They borrowed all my photographs for an exhibition they had in California, connection with Igbo art. They spell Igbo with a G there. And they have a number of so-called art historians. And an art historian in America can talk about West African and other primitive art, although it has no history. But you still call yourself a historian.
Well,
You write books about it, and it's really ethnography.
yes. Well, it's clear you could make a fortune by going on lecture tours around America, but it's delightful that you're still enormously active, and it's clear that one of the things that keeps you so active is your very active wife. So I'd like to thank both of you very much indeed for talking to us.
Well, I hope before I die that I'll have left a photographic collection here that I'm now building up.
And we can integrate that later into the films. Is there anything you want to ask, Sarah?
Good.
Good. Thank you very much indeed.